What if the biggest obstacle standing between you and the life you want is not the world around you? What if it's you? Not because you're lazy, not because you don't have enough talent, and not because you're incapable of changing, but because a part of you may be protecting the very patterns you say you want to escape. You may want success, but keep procrastinating. You may want a healthy relationship, but repeatedly choose people who hurt you. You may want peace, but constantly create situations that keep you anxious. And the strange part is, you may genuinely want to change. So why don't you? Brianna Wiest's The Mountain Is You explores one of the most uncomfortable ideas in personal growth. Sometimes the mountain we need to climb is not an external problem. It is the collection of fears, habits, emotional patterns, and unconscious behaviors that keep recreating the same life. And once you understand why you keep getting in your own way, you may finally understand. Most people think self-sabotage means deliberately destroying your own chances, but it is usually much more complicated than that. You don't wake up and decide, today I'm going to ruin my future. Instead, you make a small choice. You delay the important task. You avoid an uncomfortable conversation. You scroll instead of starting. You return to something familiar, even when you know it isn't good for you. And each choice feels reasonable in the moment. That is what makes self-sabotage so difficult to recognize. The behavior is often protecting you from something. Maybe failure, maybe rejection, maybe uncertainty, maybe the fear of becoming someone different. Your conscious mind may want the new life, while another part of you is trying to keep you safe in the old one. This creates an internal conflict. One part says, go forward. Another quietly says, stay where you know what happens. Understanding that conflict is where real change begins. Think about a person who desperately wants success, but constantly procrastinates. From the outside, it looks like laziness. But what if procrastination is actually emotional protection? Starting means discovering whether you're capable. Trying means risking failure. Finishing means being judged. Success itself can create new expectations. So the mind finds a safer alternative. It delays. The person gets temporary relief, and that relief teaches the brain something important. Avoiding this feels better. That is how a pattern becomes stronger. The behavior may create long-term pain, but it creates short-term emotional safety. And the brain is extremely interested in immediate relief. This is why simply telling yourself to be disciplined often doesn't solve the problem. You have to understand what the behavior is doing for you. What feeling are you avoiding? What fear does the habit protect you from? Once you understand the function of the behavior, you can finally change the pattern instead of simply fighting it. This leads to one of the most important ideas in the book. Your self-sabotaging behavior may once have been useful. Maybe avoiding conflict helped you survive a difficult environment. Maybe staying quiet protected you from criticism. Maybe perfectionism helped you receive approval. Maybe emotional distance protected you from rejection. Maybe constantly staying busy helped you avoid uncomfortable thoughts. At some point, these behaviors may have served a purpose. The problem is, a strategy that protects you in one stage of life can limit you in another. You may still be using an old solution for a problem that no longer exists. Imagine wearing armor long after the battle is over. The armor once protected you. Now it simply makes movement difficult. This is why change requires compassion. You don't have to hate the part of yourself that procrastinates, avoids, controls, or overthinks. You need to understand it. Ask, what is this behavior trying to protect me from? That question can reveal more than self-criticism ever will. Self-sabotage often begins with an emotional trigger. Something happens. You feel uncomfortable. Then your brain searches for a familiar response. Maybe you become distracted. Maybe you eat. Maybe you shop. Maybe you check your phone. Maybe you start planning instead of acting. Maybe you withdraw from someone. The behavior gives you a temporary emotional reward. The discomfort decreases. And because the brain learns through consequences, it remembers. Next time the same emotion appears, the same behavior becomes easier. This is how habits become automatic. You don't necessarily choose the behavior consciously anymore. The trigger appears, the response follows, and then you wonder why you keep repeating the same patterns. The answer may be that your brain has learned the pattern extremely well. Breaking it requires creating a space between the trigger and the response. That space may begin with one simple act. Notice what you're feeling before you automatically do what you usually do. One of the biggest mistakes people make is trying to eliminate a behavior without replacing what it provides. Suppose scrolling your phone helps you escape boredom. If you simply say, "I won't use my phone anymore," the underlying need remains. Soon, the discomfort returns, and the old behavior becomes tempting again. Instead, you need to understand the reward. What are you actually seeking? Stimulation, comfort, connection, relief, avoidance? Once you identify the need, you can find a healthier way to meet it. This is why lasting change is not simply about removing bad habits. It is about creating better responses to the emotions underneath them. The question isn't only, how do I stop doing this? It is also, what can I do instead when this feeling appears? That shift changes everything. You stop treating yourself like an enemy and start treating your behavior like information.
Another powerful source of self-sabotage is fear of the unknown. Even when your current life isn't satisfying, it is familiar. And the human brain often prefers a familiar problem to an unfamiliar possibility. You know what happens when you stay in the same job. You know what happens when you avoid the conversation. You know what happens when you continue the relationship. You know what happens when you postpone the dream. But you don't know what happens if you change. And uncertainty can feel dangerous. So the mind says, maybe later. Not yet. I need more preparation. Things will improve eventually. Sometimes those statements are reasonable, but sometimes they are simply fear wearing the clothes of logic. Growth requires entering territory where you don't have complete control. You don't need certainty before you move. You need enough courage to take the next step without knowing exactly where it leads. The mountain becomes climbable when you stop demanding.
Fear of failure is obvious, but fear of success can be just as powerful. Success changes your identity. It changes expectations. It can attract attention. It can create responsibility. And suddenly, the familiar excuses disappear. If you succeed, you may have to become the person capable of maintaining that success. That can feel frightening. So sometimes people unconsciously stay below their potential, not because they don't want success, but because success represents a version of life they haven't learned how to handle. This is why achieving a goal doesn't automatically solve everything. You need the emotional capacity to live at the level you are trying to reach. If your identity is built around struggle, constant stress may feel strangely familiar. Peace can feel uncomfortable. If your identity is built around being overlooked, recognition can feel threatening. If your identity is built around failure, success can challenge your entire story about yourself. Sometimes the next level requires not just achieving more, but becoming comfortable with being different.
This is where identity becomes extremely important. Your behavior often follows the story you tell yourself about who you are. If you repeatedly say, "I'm not disciplined," "I'm terrible with money," "I always ruin relationships," "I'm just an anxious person," "I'm not someone who succeeds," your brain begins looking for evidence. Every mistake becomes confirmation. Every success becomes an exception. You don't simply experience life. You interpret it through your identity. The good news is that identity can change. But you don't change it by repeating positive statements while behaving exactly as before. You change it through evidence. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, you create evidence that you are trustworthy.
Every time you finish something difficult, you create evidence that you can follow through. Every time you tolerate discomfort instead of escaping, you create evidence that you are capable of handling it. Identity is not only something you think about, it is something you practice. Your repeated actions quietly answer the question, who am I?
Perfectionism is another form of self-protection. It looks like ambition. It can even look like discipline. But underneath, it may be fear. If something must be perfect, you can always find a reason not to finish. You can keep researching, keep editing, keep preparing, keep waiting for the right moment. And because the work is never quite ready, you never have to face judgment. Perfection becomes a hiding place. The problem is that real progress requires exposure to imperfection. You have to publish the imperfect video, send the imperfect application, start before you feel completely ready, have the difficult conversation without knowing exactly what to say. The goal isn't to lower your standards. It is to stop using standards as a reason to avoid action. Done is not always better than good, but unfinished perfection has no opportunity to create results. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is allow yourself to be. There is another hidden form of perfectionism, all or nothing thinking. You exercise for 3 days, then you miss 1 day, and suddenly you think, I've failed. You eat one unhealthy meal and decide the entire day is ruined. You miss one deadline and conclude you're irresponsible. One mistake becomes a verdict about your identity. This creates a dangerous cycle. You set an unrealistic standard, you inevitably break it, you feel disappointed, then you abandon the entire effort. The solution is not to demand perfection. It is to develop consistency that can survive imperfection. Missing 1 day doesn't erase progress. A mistake doesn't erase growth. A setback doesn't mean you are back at the beginning. Real change is rarely a straight line. There will be days when you don't feel motivated. There will be moments when old patterns return. The question is not whether you will ever fall back, but how quickly you learn to return. That ability to return may be more important than never failing.
Emotional awareness is one of the foundations of change. Many people try to control their behavior without understanding their emotions. But emotions often carry information. Anger may tell you that a boundary has been crossed. Fear may tell you that something feels uncertain. Sadness may tell you that you have lost something meaningful. Envy may reveal a desire you haven't acknowledged. Shame may reveal a painful belief about yourself. The emotion itself is not necessarily the problem. The problem can be what you automatically do with it. You feel anger and attack. You feel fear and avoid. You feel sadness and isolate. You feel insecurity and seek constant reassurance. The emotion becomes a trigger for a familiar behavior. Emotional maturity means learning to experience a feeling without immediately obeying it. You can feel fear and still move. You can feel anger and still choose your words. You can feel uncertainty and still take the next step. That is emotional freedom. Sometimes we don't actually want the outcome we say we want. We want what we believe the outcome will make us feel. You may say you want money, but perhaps what you really want is safety. You may want recognition, but what you really want is to feel worthy. You may want a relationship, but what you really want is connection. You may want success, but what you really want is freedom. This distinction matters because you can pursue the wrong external goal while trying to satisfy a deeper emotional need. And even when you achieve the goal, the emotional need may remain. You get the promotion, but still feel inadequate. You earn more, but still feel unsafe. You enter a relationship, but still feel lonely. You become successful, but still fear that you're not enough. This is why inner work matters. External achievements can improve your circumstances, but they cannot automatically heal the beliefs you carry into those circumstances. Sometimes the mountain isn't the goal. It's the belief that says you will finally be enough when you reach it. Comparison can make that mountain even steeper. You look at someone else's life and compare their results with your unfinished process. You see their success, their confidence, their relationship, their home, their career, their appearance. But you don't see the private reality behind the image. You compare your entire life to a carefully selected portion of theirs, and then you wonder why you feel behind. Social media makes this especially powerful. Every scroll can become another measurement. Someone is richer, someone is younger, someone is more successful, someone seems happier. And gradually, your own progress becomes invisible to you. Comparison isn't always about wanting someone else's life. Sometimes it is about using someone else's life as evidence that your own is inadequate. A healthier question is, am I becoming more like the person I want to be? That question brings your attention back to your own mountain. Your timeline is not supposed to match someone else's. Another way we sabotage ourselves is by waiting to feel motivated. We tell ourselves, I'll start when I feel ready. I'll work when I feel inspired. I'll exercise when I feel energetic. I'll change when the timing is right. But motivation is unreliable. It rises and falls with sleep, stress, emotions, environment, and circumstances. If your behavior depends entirely on motivation, your progress will always be unstable. Discipline doesn't mean forcing yourself to feel motivated. It means learning to act even when motivation isn't present. And this doesn't require becoming harsh with yourself. You can make the desired behavior easier. Prepare the night before. Remove distractions. Create a small starting point. Make the first step so easy that resistance has less room to argue. You don't need to climb the entire mountain today. You need to take the next step, then another, and another. Over time, those small actions become evidence that you are no longer the person who keeps waiting. The environment around you can either support your growth or constantly pull you back into old patterns. If your phone is beside you every time you work, distraction becomes easier. If unhealthy food is always available, the unwanted habit requires less effort. If you spend time with people who constantly discourage change, their beliefs can become your internal voice. We often treat willpower as the solution to everything, but environment matters. A person can be extremely motivated and still struggle in an environment designed around distraction. Changing your environment isn't weakness, it's strategy. Make the behavior you want easier. Make the behavior you don't want harder. Put the book where you can see it. Keep the phone away when you need concentration. Prepare the healthy option before you're hungry. Create distance from situations that repeatedly trigger destructive behavior. You don't have to fight the same battle every day. Sometimes the smartest move is to change the battlefield. Your relationships can also reveal your unresolved patterns. Sometimes we repeatedly choose the same type of person, even when we know the relationship isn't healthy. Why? Because familiar emotional dynamics can feel like love. If you grew accustomed to inconsistency, consistency may initially feel boring. If you learned that affection had to be earned, easy love may feel suspicious. If conflict was normal in your past, peace may feel unfamiliar. The mind often confuses familiarity with safety. This doesn't mean every relationship pattern comes from childhood, but it does mean that what feels familiar isn't always what is healthy. A powerful question is, does this relationship feel good because it is healthy or because it is familiar? That distinction can be life-changing. Healing doesn't mean finding someone who perfectly removes all your discomfort. It means becoming someone who can recognize healthy connection and no longer needs chaos to feel emotionally alive. Boundaries are another form of self-respect, but many people struggle to create them because they fear disappointing others. They say yes when they mean no. They remain available when they need rest. They tolerate behavior they know is hurting them. then resentment builds. Eventually, they explode or withdraw completely. Healthy boundaries prevent that cycle. A boundary is not a punishment. It is information about what you will and will not participate in. You don't have to convince everyone to agree with your boundary. You simply have to decide what you will do when it is crossed. This can feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you have spent years being the person who keeps everyone happy. But discomfort doesn't mean the boundary is wrong. Sometimes discomfort is simply evidence that you are doing something new. You can care about someone and still say no. You can love someone and still protect your peace. You can be kind without abandoning yourself. A major part of personal growth is learning to tolerate discomfort. This may be one of the hardest lessons. We naturally want unpleasant feelings to disappear. So we distract ourselves, we overwork, we overeat, we scroll, we seek reassurance, we avoid difficult conversations, we keep ourselves busy. Anything to escape the feeling. But discomfort is not always a signal that something is wrong. Sometimes it is simply the feeling of doing something unfamiliar. The first time you set a boundary may feel uncomfortable. The first time you publish your work may feel uncomfortable. The first time you say no may feel uncomfortable. The first time you sit alone with your thoughts may feel uncomfortable. If you interpret every uncomfortable feeling as danger, you will keep returning to the familiar. Growth requires a new interpretation. This feels uncomfortable doesn't automatically mean I should stop. Sometimes it means I'm learning. This is why healing cannot be reduced to positive thinking. You can tell yourself that everything is fine while avoiding everything that needs to change. Real transformation requires honesty. What are you doing that keeps producing the life you say you don't want? Where are you choosing comfort over growth? Where are you waiting for someone else to rescue you? Where are you repeatedly ignoring what you already know? These questions can hurt, but they also return power to you. If everything is someone else's fault, you have very little control. If you can identify your own patterns, you have somewhere to begin. Taking responsibility doesn't mean blaming yourself for everything. It means recognizing the part that belongs to you. You cannot control what happened. You cannot control other people's choices. You cannot rewrite the past. But you can begin changing what you repeat. And that is where your power lives.
Forgiveness is part of this process too. But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending something didn't hurt. It doesn't mean allowing someone back into your life. And it doesn't mean saying what happened was acceptable. Sometimes forgiveness simply means refusing to let the past control every future decision. You can acknowledge the pain without building your identity around it. You can say, "This happened to me," without turning it into, "This is who I am." There is a difference between having a painful history and living inside that history forever. Your past can explain some of your patterns, but explanation doesn't have to become destiny. You're allowed to understand why you became the way you are and still decide to become someone different. Healing is not forgetting. It is learning how to carry your history without allowing it to drive your future. One of the most powerful changes happens when you stop asking, "Why am I like this?" and start asking, "What is this pattern trying to teach me?" The first question can trap you in identity. The second creates movement. Maybe your procrastination is teaching you that fear needs attention. Maybe your unhealthy relationship is teaching you that boundaries matter. Maybe your exhaustion is teaching you that constantly proving yourself has a cost. Maybe your loneliness is teaching you that connection requires vulnerability. Your patterns are not necessarily enemies. They can be messengers. This doesn't mean every painful experience has a hidden, beautiful purpose. Sometimes pain is simply painful, but you can still decide what you will learn from it. You can turn awareness into action.
The mountain becomes less frightening when every obstacle becomes information. Instead of asking, why does this keep happening to me? You begin asking, what can I do differently the next time this happens?
There's a difference between knowing what to do and being ready to do it. Most people already know some of the changes they need to make. They know they should sleep better. They know they should save money. They know they should have the conversation. They know they should stop returning to the same unhealthy situation. Knowledge isn't always the missing ingredient. Emotional readiness is. You can understand something intellectually and still be attached to the behavior emotionally. That's why change can feel contradictory. You know the habit is hurting you, but part of you still wants it. You know the relationship is unhealthy, but part of you still fears leaving. You know the opportunity matters, but part of you still wants to stay safe. Instead of judging this conflict, listen to it. Ask what each part wants. What does the fearful part need? What does the ambitious part need? What does the exhausted part need? Sometimes change begins when the internal conflict becomes a conversation instead of a war.
You also need to stop expecting your future self to be magically stronger. People often make plans based on an imaginary version of themselves. Tomorrow I'll wake up early. Tomorrow I'll focus. Tomorrow I'll have discipline. Tomorrow I won't get distracted. But tomorrow's version of you will still be human. The same environment will exist. The same temptations will exist. The same emotional patterns may appear. So instead of depending on a stronger future self, build systems that support the person you are today. Start smaller. Make the task easier. Reduce the number of decisions. Create routines. Prepare in advance. Give yourself fewer opportunities to negotiate with yourself. The goal isn't to become a person who never struggles. The goal is to build a life where your desired behavior becomes easier to repeat. You don't need unlimited willpower. You need a structure that makes progress possible even on ordinary days.
Another important idea is that your life reflects your repeated choices more than your occasional intentions. You may sincerely want peace, but what do you repeatedly choose? You may want confidence, but do you repeatedly avoid situations that would build it? You may want meaningful work, but do you repeatedly spend your best hours on distractions? Intentions matter, but repetition has more power. Your life is shaped by what happens again and again. One productive day won't transform everything. One difficult conversation won't repair every relationship. One workout won't change your health. But repeated actions create momentum. At first, the difference may be almost invisible. Then something changes. The behavior becomes familiar. The identity begins to change. And eventually, the life you once had to force yourself to create becomes normal. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. You don't climb a mountain by making one heroic movement. You climb it through thousands of ordinary steps. The mountain also represents something deeper. The distance between who you are and who you know you could become. That distance can feel overwhelming. You look at the person you want to be, and then look at yourself today. The gap seems enormous. But focusing on the entire gap can create paralysis. You don't need to become the final version of yourself today. You only need to become slightly more capable than you were yesterday. Read a few pages. Have the conversation. Finish the task. Take the walk. Say no when you mean no. Rest when you genuinely need rest. Keep one promise to yourself. Small acts can look insignificant until they become your identity. The mountain is climbed through ordinary decisions.
That may be the deepest form of self-trust. Not believing that you will never fail. Not believing that you will always be motivated. Not believing that everything will work out exactly as planned. Self-trust means knowing that when something goes wrong, you will not immediately abandon yourself. You will listen. You will adjust. You will learn. You will return. This changes the relationship you have with yourself. Instead of constantly demanding proof that you are worthy, you begin giving yourself evidence that you can rely on you. Every promise kept becomes evidence. Every boundary respected becomes evidence. Every difficult conversation faced becomes evidence. Every time you choose long-term growth over short-term relief, you strengthen that relationship. Eventually, discipline stops feeling like punishment. It becomes self-respect. And progress stops feeling like something you must earn. It becomes something you practice. There's a point where personal growth becomes less about becoming more and more about becoming less divided. You stop saying one thing while doing another. You stop pretending you're fine when you're not. You stop chasing goals you don't actually value. You stop maintaining relationships only because you're afraid of being alone. You stop performing a version of yourself designed to impress everyone else. You begin asking, what do I actually want? What matters to me? What kind of life feels meaningful? These questions can be frightening because the answers may require change. But clarity has a cost. Sometimes you discover that the life you've been chasing was built around someone else's definition of success. Sometimes you realize that being admired isn't the same as being fulfilled. Sometimes you discover that peace is more valuable than proving a point. Growing up emotionally means becoming willing to disappoint an old version of yourself. You may also discover that some of your biggest battles are not against circumstances, but against expectations. You were told what success should look like, what happiness should look like, what relationships should look like, what age you should achieve certain things, what career you should choose, what kind of person you should become. And without realizing it, you may have built a mountain from other people's expectations. Then you spend years climbing it without asking whether it is even your mountain. This is why self-awareness matters. A goal can be impressive and still be wrong for you. A life can look successful and still feel empty. A relationship can look perfect and still feel lonely. Your job is not to live the life that looks best from the outside. Your job is to build a life that makes sense from the inside. That requires courage, because authenticity often means giving up approval. Eventually, the work becomes simpler. Notice, understand, choose, repeat. Notice the trigger. Understand the pattern. Choose a different response. Repeat it until the new response becomes familiar. This is not glamorous. There may be no dramatic transformation, no single morning when everything suddenly becomes easy. Real change is often quiet. You simply notice that you handled something differently. You didn't send the angry message. You didn't return to the unhealthy situation. You started the task instead of postponing it. You rested without feeling guilty. You said no. You asked for help. You kept your promise. And these moments accumulate. One day, something that and perhaps that is why the title is so powerful. The mountain is you. The mountain is not simply your problems. It is the fear that keeps you from facing them, the habit that keeps repeating them, the belief that keeps explaining them, the identity that keeps protecting them, the comfort that keeps making them familiar. But if the mountain is partly created by your patterns, then you also have the ability to reshape it. You can change the way you respond. You can question the belief. You can create a new habit. You can choose. So when you find yourself repeating an old pattern, don't immediately attack yourself. Pause. Ask what is happening beneath the behavior. What are you afraid of? What are you trying to avoid? What temporary relief are you receiving? What would happen if you didn't follow the familiar response? And then ask one more question. What would I choose if I trusted myself? That question can open a different path.
Maybe you would begin. Maybe you would leave. Maybe you would speak. Maybe you would rest. Maybe you would take the opportunity. Maybe you would finally stop waiting for permission. You don't need to know exactly how the entire journey ends. You only need enough clarity to take the next honest step. The mountain may be high, but you don't climb it by staring at the summit. You climb it by placing one foot in front of the other.
And eventually, you may realize something unexpected. The person you were trying so hard to become was not waiting somewhere at the top of the mountain. They were being built during the climb. Every difficult choice strengthened you. Every boundary taught you self-respect. Every failure taught you flexibility. Every uncomfortable conversation taught you courage. Every time you returned after falling, you built resilience. The mountain changed you because climbing it required you to change. And perhaps the greatest reward isn't reaching a perfect life. There is no perfect life. The reward is becoming someone who can meet life honestly. Someone who doesn't need everything to be certain before moving. Someone who can experience discomfort without immediately escaping. Someone who can love without abandoning themselves. Someone who can fail without deciding they are a failure. Someone who can succeed without needing success to prove their worth.
So don't ask yourself, how do I become a completely different person? Ask something smaller. What is one pattern I am ready to stop repeating? Then ask, what is one choice I can make differently today? Maybe it is starting the work. Maybe it is putting the phone away. Maybe it is telling the truth. Maybe it is setting a boundary. Maybe it is forgiving yourself. Maybe it is walking away from something you already know is wrong for you. The answer will be different for everyone, but the principle remains the same. Your life changes when your repeated choices change. And your choices change when you become conscious of the patterns behind them. The mountain may not disappear, but you don't need it to. You only need to become the person who can climb it.
If this journey gave you a new way to understand yourself, remember this. You are not your worst habit. You are not your past. You are not the mistake you made. You are not the relationship that ended. You are not
The mountain is you, but so is the person who climbs it. The fear is you, but so is the courage that faces it. The old pattern is you, but so is the awareness that can change it. And perhaps that is the most important lesson. You don't have to wait for your life to become easier before you begin changing. You begin changing, and slowly your life begins to respond. If this book made you look at your own patterns differently, take one idea from it today and put it into action. Not tomorrow, not when you feel ready, today. Because understanding yourself is only the beginning. The real transformation happens when awareness becomes a choice, and that choice becomes a habit. If you enjoyed this journey, like this video and subscribe for more psychology, human behavior, self-development, and powerful book summaries. And remember, you don't have to conquer the entire mountain today. Just take the next step.